We're joined now by Principal Researcher at the CSIR, Prof Suzan Oelofse. A very good afternoon to you, Prof. Thank you so much for availing yourself to SABC News this afternoon.
Good afternoon, and thank you for the opportunity.
You're most welcome. I mean, it's quite ironic and sadly ironic, if I might add, isn't it, that we talk of this serious food shortage on one hand in our country, but then you've done a research which points to food wastage on the other hand. Talk to us about your findings, the findings of the report when it comes to this food wastage. One assumes that the food wastage does indeed happen in urban areas. You can, correct me if I'm wrong.
The food wastage that we have found is throughout the supply chain. It starts right from on farm all the way through at every stage in the supply chain up until consumption. So it is not only linked to the urban areas, but a lot of the wastage, in actual fact, 18% of the overall wastage occurs at consumption level. And that to me is quite staggering, because this is more than 3 times the amount that we previously estimated at the consumption stage of the supply chain. And the reason for this wastage is because of our consumption-based consumers. We are a lot closer to wastage that occur in Europe and other developed countries as compared to other countries in Africa and in sub-Saharan Africa. And that's perhaps where the difference lies. Our previous estimates looked at assumptions that were based on sub-Saharan Africa, because we didn't have South African data to base our estimates on. And this study specifically looked at the local South African data. The other place in the supply chain where a lot of wastage is happening is actually at processing and packaging. And the reason for the wastage there is because that is where it is determined which of the food will make it into the shop shelf. So everything that does not meet the standards that is expected by the consumers will not make it into the packet at packaging stage. And also during processing, this is where the peels and the pips are taken off. We see our consumers are very much convenience driven, and therefore they look for pre-processed food. And that is why the wastage is then mostly at the processing and packaging stage of the supply chain.
Yeah, so what I read from your study, of course, was that there's an indication that an estimated 10.3 million tons a year of edible food earmarked for human consumption in South Africa does not, in fact, reach, the stomachs of South Africans. You're talking about, and I think this was where I was going with my conversation as well, in terms of, I think you anticipated my next question. It was pertaining to how this wastage is actually then happening. You talk about at consumption level. Maybe you can just explain to how exactly, when you say at consumption level, what exactly does that mean in layman's terms?
Okay, at consumption level, that will typically be in the household kitchen.
Yeah.
So the wastage that you find at the household level is typically associated with either preparing too much food that ends up as plate waste.
Yeah.
That typically will either go to animal feed or be thrown in the dustbin. Also, if there are poor food preparation and the food is burnt, then that will make it into the dustbin and not to the human stomach. And then a lot of wastage happens as a result of consumers misinterpreting the date labels on the food. In South Africa, we typically see a sell-by date, a use-by date, a best before date, and an expiry date. Now, the sell-by date is aimed at the retailers to know by which date they must move the food off the shelves to make space for the new food coming into the shop. But food is typically still good for consumption at least 3 weeks after the sell-by date. Then we have the best before date. And that is the date up until which the quality of the food in the packet is guaranteed by the producer. And that will typically mean the color of the tomato will be a specific shade of red, and it will be firm to a certain extent. But that does not mean that after that date, the food is no longer fit for consumption.
Yeah.
In actual fact, in some instances, it may be nicer to eat after that date.
Yeah, yeah. Sorry, Prof, just to come in here. There was something, and I hate to put you in this position to comment on it, but it's interesting to me because, recently, and I know your study didn't necessarily focus on this, but I wonder if it's something that might be then of interest in looking at this issue of food waste. Prof, recently we had this unrest where there was a lot of looting that took place. And then what happened after that was that food was taken and it was burnt by police, and a lot of food wastage that I saw, that I thought, some of that food could not have been perhaps given out to charities or whatever the situation is. We were told that it was bad for the economy for it to be still in the system, in the South African system. And I really wonder, as you are watching this, I assume this is something that you watched quite keenly with interest. I mean, what were your thoughts on that? Because to me, that's tantamount to what we're talking about today, which is the issue of food wastage. And I wonder if there might be some kind of study that is perhaps based on that.
We haven't got a specific study based on that, but it certainly is a concern. Obviously, if the food gets looted before it gets sold, then it impacts the economy. Also, donations typically happen at store level when the food has reached its sell-by date, but it's no longer, it cannot be sold anymore, but it is still perfectly good for donations. So that food then also disappears and does not reach necessarily the human stomach. But what was even more concerning to me is the fact that the whole supply chain was interrupted, which means that it's not only the food that was looted that in the end got wasted, but also the supply chain that normally supplies to those specific stores and areas that was now interrupted, which had a snowball effect up the value chain to pre-consumer wastage. Because you can't necessarily, at a short notice, find an alternative market for the produce that you earmarked for a specific area. So I suspect that the looting had a significant higher food wastage effect than what we currently see.
Yeah, and just talk to us about, maybe I should talk about what led to the study. I do understand the Department of Science and Innovation got involved and certainly funded this particular report. But, when it comes to these kinds of things, I always want to know, what the objectives are, or maybe, what is the solution in this regard? I mean, what exactly does one say is the solution to food wastage? I think when we talk about food shortage, it's easier to kind of try and figure out, what the solutions could be to that. But one wonders, when it comes to the issue of food wastage, is there anything that can then be said after that? I mean, what the point of the whole report?
Okay, the reason why the study was undertaken is, first of all, South Africa signed up to the Sustainable Development Goals, which set a target of reducing food wastage by 50% by 2030. So since South Africa committed to that target, we have to have a baseline against which we can measure our progress. And that was the intention of the study, to estimate the national food wastage based on South African data, so that we have a baseline against which we can measure the impact that we are having, if we are in fact reducing the food waste. You're asking for the solutions. Currently, the Consumer Goods Council work with a number of industry players on voluntary agreements to reduce food wastage. And they are quite far advanced already in getting signatories on board for those voluntary agreements. But then also at a more general level, I think the answer to resolving a lot of the food wastage issues lies in better planning and better stock management throughout the supply chain.
Yeah, and I wonder if this makes sense, but my next question was really about that on your last point, in terms of how do we sort of offset this issue that we have, where we had the food shortage on one hand, and of course that of the food wastage. I mean, I'm sure there's some kind of equilibrium that we can reach at some point where, there's a balance in terms of what's going on here.
Absolutely. We need all the players in the supply chain to be more aware of the food wastage. And in that regard, the CSIR, together with the Department of Environmental Affairs, released a food waste prevention and management guideline earlier this year that specifically look at every stage in the supply chain, what are the causes of the food wastage, and what can potentially be done to reduce the food wastage. And if we get to a stage where we have less food wastage, we will definitely have better food security, because currently the food wastage results in higher prices being charged for food, especially at retail level, because retailers already have to make provision for the cost associated with the wastage at the end that needs to be disposed of properly. And that cost is passed on to the consumer. And the same goes for the other players in the supply chain. Yeah. So if we can reduce the wastage, then prices may come down, and that will assist with food security, because it will make food more accessible to more people if it is not that expensive.
Prof, your point's very well put. Thank you very much for giving us your time here on SABC News. We certainly do appreciate you looking into all of this.
Thank you very much.
All right, that is Professor Suzan Oelofse, who's a principal researcher at the CSIR, and we're talking about a food supply in South Africa where there is a lot of food wastage that is currently happening in our shores. All right.